My children thought I was just a confused old woman. They called me senile, and behind my back they were plotting to put me in the cheapest home they could find and split the profits from my house. They thought I couldn't hear their whispers, but their own security cameras could. They never imagined their doting mother was compiling evidence, and you will not believe the look on their faces when I played the recordings of their entire plot for the family lawyer. The scent of pot roast has a way of wallpapering over the cracks in a family. For the past 50 years, it's been the official smell of Sunday dinner in my house, a tradition my late husband Richard insisted on. Now it's just me, and the tradition has become a performance. My children, Thomas and Clara, think I do it out of habit, a relic of a mind that's slowly fading. They're wrong. I do it because routine is the perfect camouflage. They arrived precisely at 5, as they always do. Clara came in first. Her voice pitched an octave higher than normal, the one she uses for toddlers, and apparently for me. She told me how wonderful the house smelled, her eyes doing a quick scan of the room, checking for dust on the mantelpiece or newspapers left on the floor. Thomas followed, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder and steering me toward my own dining room chair as if I might forget where I sit after half a century. He spoke slowly, enunciating every word, asking if I'd had a good week. His voice was so loud I was sure the neighbors could hear. It was all for show, this performance of doting care. They've convinced themselves I'm deaf as a post. It's a convenient diagnosis. It allows them to speak freely. We sat down to eat. The silverware, my wedding silver, felt heavy and cool in my hands. It's one of the few things in this house they haven't suggested I sell for something more manageable. I served the roast, my hands steady, and listened to them talk. Clara mentioned how tired I looked, that the circles under my eyes were getting darker. She said it with such profound theatrical concern. Thomas agreed, chiming in that a big house like this must be draining for a woman my age. They carried on a conversation between themselves right across the table from me about my own well-being. They debated whether I was eating properly when they weren't around, whether I was remembering to take my medication. It was almost funny, really. I've balanced my own checkbook to the penny for 60 years and never missed a bill, but they were worried I'd forget a little white pill. The doorbell rang midway through dinner, a jarring interruption to their carefully managed script. Clara sighed a martyr's sigh and went to the door. She came back, holding a small, discreet brown package. She told me I really needed to be more careful with online shopping, that there were so many scams out there targeting seniors. She handed it to me, and I saw the return address. Just a simple initial L in the corner, written in the familiar neat print of my grandson, Leo. He was my youngest son's boy, the only one who looked at me and still saw a person instead of a problem. I took the package and placed it on the sideboard, murmuring something about it being a new book I'd ordered. They accepted this without a second thought. Of course they did. An old woman ordering a book was perfectly within the realm of their expectations. They stayed for another hour. The conversation circling the same drain, the leaky faucet in the upstairs bath, the cost of property taxes, the yard that was getting overgrown. Every topic was a hook and angle to prove that this life, my life, was too much for me to handle alone. They spoke of nursing homes not as a threat, but as a gentle, loving solution. They called them assisted living communities, painting pictures of bingo nights and new friends, all while avoiding my gaze. They thought my silence was agreement, my placid expression a sign of senile compliance. When they finally left, the performance ended. Clara hugged me, her touch light and quick, as if she were afraid of catching my age. Thomas told me to be sure and lock the door, his voice booming in the quiet hallway. I smiled. My vacant little smile waved from the doorway and watched their car pull away, its red taillights disappearing down the street. I locked the door. Then I walked not to my bedroom to get some rest, but to Richard's old study at the back of the house. The room was the same as he'd left it, lined with books from floor to ceiling. But in the center, on his old mahogany desk, sat a state-of-the-art computer. I picked up the small package from the sideboard and opened it. Inside was a solid-state drive no bigger than a credit card with a terabyte of storage, a little gift from Leo. I sat down in the worn leather chair, the familiar squeak a small comfort. I slid on a pair of noise-canceling headphones, the world outside fading into absolute silence. On the screen, I pulled up a piece of software, a grid of video feeds populating the monitor. My living room, the kitchen, the hallway, all shown in crystal clear high definition from 4 different angles. These were their cameras, the ones they'd installed to keep an eye on me to make sure I didn't fall. They'd hired a company that Thomas's friend owned, and they'd told me it was just a simple security system. They had no idea I'd had Leo, my brilliant grandson who works in cybersecurity, piggyback the signal. They had no idea that for the past 3 months, I'd been saving every file. I moved the mouse and clicked on a folder labeled Sunday, August 10th. I selected the living room feed and rewound to the moment they thought I was in the kitchen, fussing over the gravy. Their voices came through the headphones, no longer loud and slow, but hushed, sharp and cruel. Clara's whisper about how easy it would be to get me declared incompetent. Thomas's ugly laugh as he agreed, talking about selling the house and splitting the profits before I wasted it all. My face, reflected faintly on the dark screen, was not that of a frail, confused old woman. It was a mask of cold, hard resolve. The performance was over. The documentation was complete. After a storm, there's a strange kind of quiet. The air feels washed clean, but you know the wreckage is still there, just waiting to be discovered in the light of day. The 3 days after that Sunday dinner felt just like that. I went about my business, tending to my garden, reading my books, and letting the silence in my house feel like a coiled spring. I was waiting. I knew my son's greed, like a chronic illness, would have a flare-up soon. It didn't take long. The call came on Wednesday morning. It was Thomas. His voice was thick with a false, sugary concern that I'd come to recognize as the prelude to an attack. He told me he'd been thinking, and he was worried I had some old financial paperwork that might be getting confusing. He mentioned that with taxes and everything, it was probably best if he came over to help me sort through it. He didn't want me to get overwhelmed. I knew exactly what paperwork he meant. On the recordings, I'd heard him tell Clara about the savings bond my Richard had bought 30 years ago, a Series EE bond purchased for $5,000 that was now mature and worth over $20,000. He'd talked about it like it was a treasure he'd just discovered on a map, a forgotten pile of cash just waiting for him. I played my part, of course. I made my voice sound a little frail, a little relieved. I told him that would be so helpful, and we agreed he'd come by that afternoon. He arrived carrying a leather briefcase, looking every bit the important son coming to manage his dotty mother's affairs. He probably imagined the scene in his head, him, the competent man of business, patiently sifting through my life while I sat by knitting and smiling gratefully. He set up his little command center at the dining room table, the very same spot where he'd plotted against me just days before. He asked for my box of important documents. I retrieved it for him from the hall closet. It was an old shoebox, faded and soft at the corners, held together with a rubber band. He gave a little pitying smirk when I placed it on the table. For the next hour, he was the picture of patronizing diligence. He'd pull out a slip of paper, hold it up, and explain what it was in a loud, slow voice. He told me this was an old utility bill from 1998 and that I didn't need to keep it. He explained what a stock certificate was, even though my name was on it as the purchaser. All the while, I could see his fingers were searching his eyes, scanning for the official watermarked paper of the bond. He was trying to be casual, but there was a hungry, restless energy about him. The pile of discarded, unimportant papers grew, and his pleasant facade started to crack. The smile became a little tighter, the patient tone a little more forced. Finally, he couldn't find it. He'd gone through the entire box twice. He looked up at me, the condescension replaced with a flicker of raw annoyance. He asked where I kept my bonds, my investments. I gave him a blank look, as if trying to recall a very distant memory. He pressed his voice, losing its careful modulation. He wanted to know about the savings bond, the one Richard had bought for our anniversary all those years ago. He said he was worried it might expire if we didn't cash it in soon. This was the moment. The first little tug on the web I'd been spinning. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, pretending to be deep in thought. Then I looked at him, my expression as placid as a milk pond. I told him, "Oh, that bond." I remembered it was maturing. I said I was at the bank last week for something else, and I just decided to take care of it while I was there. You should have seen the look on his face. It was like watching a statue crack. All the feigned patience, all the loving concern, it all just fell away in an instant. His eyes narrowed. He asked me which bank. I told him I couldn't quite recall the teller's name, but she was very nice. He wasn't asking about the teller. His voice was sharp now, demanding. He wanted to know what I did with the money. I just smiled my gentle, empty smile. I told him I thought it was best to put it away for a rainy day. A rainy day. The phrase just hung there between us. For him, it wasn't raining, it was a drought. The $20,000 he had already spent in his mind, the money he needed to cover his bad business debts, had vanished into thin air. He sputtered, trying to regain control. He told me that wasn't safe, that a large sum of cash was a risk for someone like me. He said I needed to tell him where it was so he could put it in a proper account. But the desperation was rolling off him in waves. He had no power here, no leverage. He was a thief who had arrived to find the vault empty. He saw a frail old woman, but for the first time, he also saw a locked door. He left soon after that, the briefcase snapping shut with a sound of pure frustration. He forgot to tell me to have a nice day. As soon as his car was out of the driveway, I went to my study. The quiet of the house was a comfort, now a shield. I turned on the computer and started the encrypted video call. A moment later, Leo's face appeared on the screen, his smile warm and genuine. I told him that Phase 1 was complete. I could see the pride in his eyes. He confirmed it from his end. He told me the transfer was complete. $21,452 was now sitting in the new irrevocable trust, an account my dear son Thomas didn't even know existed. An account that only I and my trusted Leo could control. The first stone had been thrown, and it had landed exactly where it was meant to. When you poke a hornet's nest, you don't just get one angry hornet. You get the whole swarm. I knew Thomas wouldn't keep his failure to himself for long. His pride was too wounded and his wallet was too empty. The quiet in my house lasted exactly one day. Then on Thursday evening, the swarm began to gather. I was in my study, ostensibly reading a history of the Byzantine Empire, but my real attention was on the small screen in the corner of my monitor showing the front door camera. Clara's car pulled into the driveway. She practically ran to the door, and Thomas let her in. They went straight to the kitchen, the one room where the audio pickup was the clearest, thanks to a microphone I'd had Leo disguise as a smoke detector. I put my headphones on. Their conversation wasn't a plot anymore. It was a panicked strategy session. Thomas was pacing, and I could hear the frantic energy in his voice as he recounted the story of the missing bond money. Clara, ever the pragmatist, was trying to calm him down, but her own voice was tight with fear. The word they kept coming back to was unpredictable. My little move had thrown them. For a moment, they considered the possibility that I was more lucid than they thought, but they dismissed it almost immediately. Arrogance is a powerful sedative. They decided it was a fluke, a moment of clarity, but a dangerous one. They concluded I was becoming erratic, and that was all the justification they needed. Their solution was swift and unanimous. They had to accelerate the plan. They needed to get power of attorney, and they needed to do it now before I could have another lucid moment and give away the house to a cat shelter. Clara was the one who suggested using Mr. Davies, our family lawyer, for 30 years. She said he'd known me forever. He'd seen my decline with his own eyes at family functions. He would be sympathetic. He would see them as the loving, responsible children just trying to protect their poor, confused mother. They were so confident in the story they'd built. They ended their meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just thieves anymore. In their minds, they were heroes on a rescue mission. The next afternoon, they presented their plan to me. They sat me down in my own living room, their faces etched with serious, solemn concern. It was a well-rehearsed performance. They told me they were worried that my little financial adventure proved I couldn't manage things on my own anymore. They told me they'd made an appointment with Mr. Davies just to get some paperwork in order to make things easier for me. They said it would give them the ability to help me pay my bills and manage the house, so I wouldn't have to worry my pretty little head about it. The phrase power of attorney was wrapped in so many layers of soft, loving words, it almost sounded like a gift. I played my part. I looked from one to the other, my eyes wide. I wrung my hands a little. I asked what it all meant, my voice trembling just enough. I let them explain it to me in simple, patronizing terms, and then I submitted. I nodded meekly and told them that if they thought it was best, then I would do it. The relief that washed over their faces was immense. They had their control back. They left that day believing once again that they were in charge. That night, the real work began. With the house quiet and the world outside dark, I was in my study, the glow of the monitor illuminating my desk. This was my hidden preparation. I wasn't knitting or watching television. I was meticulously editing video files. I was an archivist by trade, and my skills had not faded with age. I worked with precision, isolating the most damning conversations. I clipped the audio from the kitchen, cleaning it up, until every whispered, greedy word was perfectly clear. I created a master folder, and inside I placed my exhibits. Exhibit A, Conspiracy to Seize Assets. AUG 10, Exhibit B, Discussion of Cheap Nursing Homes. July 28th. Exhibit C, Mocking My Hearing Loss. AUG 10. Each file was a nail for their coffin. When I was done, I logged into a secure cloud server, the one Leo had set up for me, and began to upload everything. It was linked to an email address my children knew nothing about, belonging to a lawyer they had never met. The next day, I had lunch with Leo. We met at a small cafe downtown, a place where no one would know us. It felt good to be out, to be moving in the world as myself, not as the character I played at home. He looked at me, his eyes full of the same quiet intelligence that had belonged to his father, my dear lost son. I passed him a small, heavy envelope across the table. I told him it contained a backup of everything, along with a sealed letter. I made him promise he would only open the letter if he couldn't get in touch with me for 48 hours after the meeting with Mr. Davies. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded, his expression serious. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about money or a house. It was about protecting his grandmother's dignity. It was about justice. When I got home, I looked at the calendar hanging in the kitchen. I had circled the date for the lawyer's appointment in red ink. It was less than a week away. My children thought they were leading me into an ambush where they held all the power. They had no idea that I was the one who had set the trap. They thought they were the authors of my final chapter. They were about to find out I was the editor, and I had already written the end. The morning of the appointment with Mr. Davies dawned bright and clear. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy blue dress and the string of pearls Richard had given me for our 30th anniversary. To my children, I would look like a respectable widow, perhaps a bit lost, ready to be led to the slaughter. They had been insufferably smug for the past few days, calling with reminders, their voices dripping with the false patience of someone who believes they have already won. They thought this was their day of victory, the day they would finally chain me down with legal papers and take control of everything I had spent a lifetime building. They had no idea the real event of the day was scheduled to happen an hour before we were all due to meet. I made myself a cup of tea and took it to my study, my command center. On the monitor, I already had the video feeds queued up. One for Thomas's oversized suburban house, one for Clara's pristine townhouse. I watched as a nondescript white van, a local courier service, pulled up to Thomas's front walk. I had timed it perfectly. I knew he would be home, pacing in his suit, psyching himself up for the meeting. I watched him answer the door, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the interruption. He signed for the crisp, cream-colored envelope, the logo of a prestigious downtown law firm embossed in the corner. It was a firm he had never heard of. My firm. I leaned forward, my tea forgotten. I watched him on the screen as he slid open the envelope with a letter opener from his desk. He unfolded the single heavy sheet of paper inside. You know it's a fascinating thing to watch a man's entire world collapse in high definition. His confident posture melted first. He sank into his chair as if his bones had turned to dust. He read the letter once, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read it a second time, his mouth falling slightly open. On the third read, the full weight of it hit him. I could see it in the way the color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly gray. The letter was short, formal, and utterly brutal. It was a courtesy notification informing him that I, his mother, Eleanor Vance, had established an irrevocable trust several weeks ago. It stated that all my significant assets, including my portfolio, my savings, and the deed to the family home he was so eager to sell, had been transferred into this trust. And then the final, beautiful, crushing blow. The sole trustee, the person with complete and total control over every last penny, was my grandson, Leo. Thomas's hand holding the letter began to shake. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. I switched the audio feed. A moment later, I could hear his panicked, strangled voice as he called Clara. He told her there was a letter that she needed to see if she got one too. Right on cue, the courier van appeared on the other screen, pulling up to Clara's manicured lawn. The scene repeated itself, a tragic little echo. Clara, dressed in her power suit for the lawyer's meeting, accepted the envelope. I watched her read it. Her reaction a mirror image of her brother's confusion, followed by disbelief, followed by pure, unadulterated panic. Their phone call was a symphony of chaos. I listened to them talk over each other, their voices escalating into frantic shouts. Irrevocable. What did that mean, a trust? How could she do that? And Leo? How could it be Leo? They had always dismissed him as a quiet, nerdy boy who wasted his time on computers. The idea that he, not them, now held the keys to the kingdom was an indignity so profound it left them gasping. They had spent weeks plotting how to get power of attorney, how to have me declared incompetent, how to take control of my estate. And all the while I had been building a fortress they didn't even know existed. An irrevocable trust isn't a fence. It's a castle with stone walls 20 feet thick. It means the assets inside are no longer mine to control, and therefore they are not mine to be taken. They belong to the trust, and the trust belongs to Leo. My children's entire scheme wasn't just foiled, it was rendered completely and utterly irrelevant. They had been playing checkers, moving their little pieces around the board with such self-importance. They were just now realizing I had been playing chess, and I'd declared checkmate 4 moves ago. Their panic led them, as I knew it would, to Mr. Davies. I heard Thomas tell Clara he was calling him right now to find out what was going on. I smiled. This was the next act of the play. Thomas called back a few minutes later, his voice now a terrified whisper. He told Clara that Mr. Davies knew nothing. He hadn't heard about any trust, any new lawyer. He was as blindsided as they were. And that right there was the moment they understood. They weren't fighting their confused old mother anymore. They were up against a sharp, unknown, and obviously expensive legal team. They were out of their depth, flailing in an ocean of legal consequences they couldn't begin to understand. They realized in that final, frantic conversation that their meeting to obtain power of attorney was now a complete farce. They couldn't take power over an estate that I no longer technically owned. They had no cards left to play. They had nothing. I watched their faces on the twin screens, their arrogance replaced with the raw, ugly fear of people who have been totally and comprehensively outmaneuvered. I calmly closed the application on my computer. The screens went black. The house was silent again. I stood up, straightened the lapels of my dress, and picked up my handbag from the chair. It was 10:30, time to go. The meeting was still on. They didn't know why I would still go, what I could possibly have left to do to them. Their fear was a delicious appetizer. The main course was yet to be served. The law office of Davies, and Finch smelled exactly the same as it had for the last 30 years, a mixture of old paper, lemon polish, and the faint, dusty scent of other people's problems. I walked through the heavy oak door and saw them immediately. My children. They were sitting in the waiting area, perched on the edge of 2 velvet chairs that looked like they might swallow them whole. Their faces were pale, their bodies tight with a desperate, nervous energy. All the smug confidence from the past week had evaporated, leaving behind the hollowed-out look of people who know they are walking into a storm of their own making. Mr. Davies, a man I'd known since he was a junior partner, came out to greet me. His face was a well-practiced mask of sympathy. He took my hand in both of his, telling me how sorry he was that we had to meet under such stressful circumstances. He looked at me with kind, pitying eyes, and in that moment, I knew my children had already been talking to him, planting their seeds of my supposed confusion. Just then, the oak door opened again, and my new lawyer, Ms. Albright, stepped inside. She was a woman in her late 40s, sharp and impeccably dressed, with a quiet, unshakable confidence that seemed to suck the air out of the room. She simply nodded at Mr. Davies, her eyes taking in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance. Mr. Davies looked completely taken aback. Thomas and Clara stared at her as if she were an executioner who had arrived unannounced. A delicious, cold satisfaction settled in my chest. The game had begun. Mr. Davies led us all into the main conference room. It was a long, intimidating room, dominated by a polished mahogany table that reflected the grim faces of everyone present. Thomas and Clara scrambled to sit on one side, a united front of desperation. Mr. Davies took his place at the head of the table, looking deeply uncomfortable. Ms. Albright and I sat opposite my children. The battle lines, so long hidden behind fake smiles and condescending pleasantries, were now starkly, beautifully clear. Before Ms. Albright could even open her briefcase, Thomas launched his final, pathetic offensive. He directed his words to Mr. Davies, clinging to the hope that their long-standing relationship would save him. He spoke of his deep love and concern for me, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. He talked about my recent erratic behavior, my confusion. He painted the irrevocable trust not as a masterstroke of strategy, but as definitive proof that I was being manipulated by a predatory outside influence, and he shot a venomous look toward an empty chair meant for my grandson Leo. Clara joined in, her voice trembling as she described how they were just trying to protect me from myself to keep my legacy safe. They were trying to build a narrative of their loving care and my tragic senility one last time. I let them talk. I let them spin their web of lies until it filled the silent room. When they finally paused breathless from their performance, I did not respond. I simply held up my hand. The gesture was small, but it cut through their panic like a knife. The room fell silent. I turned to Mr. Davies and, keeping my voice calm and even, told him that there seemed to be a significant misunderstanding regarding my cognitive abilities. I suggested that instead of debating the matter, it might be more efficient to simply present some clarifying evidence. And with that, I opened my laptop. I pulled an HDMI cable from my handbag and calmly plugged it into the port on the table. The large monitor on the wall, usually reserved for corporate presentations, flickered to life, mirroring my screen. Every eye in the room was fixed on that monitor. My children watched with a dawning animal terror. They didn't know what was coming, but they knew it was for them. I moved the mouse and pressed play. The screen went black for a second, and then a simple title card appeared in clean white letters, "A Study in Competence." Compiled by Eleanor Vance. The first clip began. It was a high-angle shot of my dining room from the previous Sunday. It showed Thomas and Clara at the table. Their voices, captured in perfect digital clarity by the microphone they didn't know about, filled the conference room. I heard Clara mocking the way I cupped my ear to hear, followed by Thomas's ugly, dismissive laugh. On screen, a timestamp appeared in the bottom corner. Sunday, August 10th, 5:47 p.m. I glanced at my daughter. The color had drained from her face. Her mouth hung open in a silent gasp of horror. The next clip played without pause. The kitchen camera. Thomas and Clara whispering by the sink, thinking I was out of earshot. Their entire conversation about how easy it would be to sell the house once they got power of attorney. How they'd put me in the cheapest, decent place they could find. I saw Thomas flinch as if he'd been physically struck. Clip after clip. 10 minutes of their greatest hits of cruelty and greed. The conversation where Thomas called the savings bond a forgotten windfall that was practically his already. The clip of Clara complaining about having to waste her Sundays on these depressing dinners. Each piece of evidence was presented coldly, clinically, with dates, times, and subtitles for every whispered word. It was a relentless, overwhelming cascade of their own treachery recorded by their own devices. I spent as much time watching Mr. Davies as I did my own children. His face was a study in transformation. His initial look of professional concern had melted into confusion. That confusion had given way to a stunned, wide-eyed shock. And as the final clips played, the shock hardened into a cold, quiet fury. This was not just a family squabble. This was a meticulously documented conspiracy to defraud a client he had known for decades. The pity in his eyes was gone, replaced by the icy glare of a lawyer who has been lied to, whose professional trust has been violated. He wasn't their ally anymore. He was their judge. When the video ended, displaying a final black screen, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence filled with the ghosts of their own words. Clara was now weeping openly, not tears of remorse, but the guttural sobs of someone who has been caught cornered and completely destroyed. Thomas was staring at the blank monitor, his face ashen, his body rigid with shock. He was a statue of his own ruin, Ms. Albright chose that moment to speak, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. She stated calmly that given the evidence presented, my competence was clearly not a matter for debate. She added that any further legal action on their part to pursue control of my affairs would be met with a countersuit for malicious prosecution and a formal report of suspected elder fraud filed with the state. The final nail. There was nowhere left for them to go. I looked across the table past my sharp new lawyer and truly saw my children. Not as the monsters who had betrayed me, but as they were in that moment, small, broken, and utterly defeated. I had not raised my voice. I had not wept. I had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had devoured them whole. My work was done. We left them sitting in that silent conference room, two broken statues in a mahogany tomb. Ms. Albright packed her briefcase with crisp, efficient movements, her work done. I simply stood up, adjusted my dress, and walked out without a backward glance. We didn't hear what Mr. Davies said to them after we left, but I could imagine it. The cold, formal termination of their relationship. The mention of his ethical duty to report potential elder abuse to the state bar. The sound of the last door of their old life closing and locking behind them forever. The air in the hallway and then on the street outside felt different. It was clean and light, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could take a full, deep breath. The first thing I did when I got home was call a locksmith. A young man with kind eyes and skillful hands came within the hour. I watched as he expertly dismantled the old locks on my front and back doors, the very locks my children had keys to. He replaced them with new, heavy-duty deadbolts. When he was finished, he handed me a set of 3 freshly cut keys. They felt cool and solid in my palm. He showed me how the new bolt slid home with a satisfying, definitive thud. That sound was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of my fortress being secured, the sound of peace. The fallout began later that afternoon, just as I knew it would. Leo called me, his voice humming with a quiet satisfaction he was trying very hard to conceal. He told me he'd had a chat with our cousin Sarah, who is the undisputed communications hub of the entire extended family. He said he just happened to mention that there had been some unfortunate legal developments regarding Thomas and Clara's management of my affairs. He knew, as I did, that telling Sarah was like publishing a story on the front page of the family newspaper. By nightfall, the entire grapevine would be buzzing. The narrative my children had so carefully crafted for years, that of the doting, caring son and daughter, saddled with a difficult, fading mother, was being publicly dismantled. Their social standing, the respect they craved in the community, was turning to ash in their mouths. That evening, Leo came over for dinner. There was no heavy pot roast, no tense silence, no performative concern. I made a simple lemon chicken, and we ate in the kitchen, the windows open to the cool evening air. We didn't talk about the meeting or the video or the trust. We talked about his plans for the future, about a new documentary I'd watched about the stubborn weeds in my rose garden. The conversation was light and easy, the laughter genuine. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my house didn't feel like a stage or a prison. It felt like a home. It felt like mine. Looking at my grandson across the table, his face open and kind, I knew I had not lost my family. I had simply pruned the dead branches so that the healthy ones could finally thrive. The final test came 2 days later. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed Thomas's name. I hesitated for only a second before answering. I needed to hear it. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable. The booming condescension was gone, replaced by a broken, ragged weeping. He was sobbing, begging, the words tumbling out in a pathetic stream of self-pity. He told me he was sorry, that he didn't mean it, that he was just so scared about his debts. He begged me to fix it, to undo the trust, to make things go back to the way they were. He wasn't apologizing for hurting me. He was apologizing for getting caught. He was weeping for his own consequences. I listened to the entire performance without saying a single word. I let the silence stretch out after his last desperate plea. I let him sit in the pathetic ruin he had built for himself. When I finally spoke, my voice was not angry or triumphant. It was just calm, clear, and final. I told him, "The consequences are your own to live with, Thomas." Then I pressed the red icon on the screen, ending the call. I opened my contacts, found his name, and selected the option to block his number. Then I found Clara's and did the same. A few simple taps on a glass screen, and a lifetime of toxic obligation was severed. The door was locked. The line was cut. The new reality was here, and it was wonderfully, beautifully quiet. Eleanor learned a powerful lesson through her ordeal. She realized that when people show you their true colors, you must not only believe them, but you must also document it. Her children consistently mistook her quiet observation for weakness, but it was never that. It was the patient, focused silence of a camera press recording gathering undeniable truth. In the end, she understood that true justice isn't won with loud arguments or emotional pleas. It is secured by presenting the facts so clearly and completely that there is simply nothing left to be said. And that she now knew is what real accountability looks like.